Tashdile, and good evening to our speaker, Bethany Allen, and to our lovely live audience tuning in from across the globe. Welcome to the virtual event of Freedom Hour, an online discussion hosted by the Asia Freedom Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that promotes democracy and religious freedom in Tibet and China. I'm Sakina Bhatt, the moderator for Asia Freedom Institute's Freedom Hour. Today we have with us Bethany Allen, the author of the much talked about book Beijing Rules: How China Weaponized Its Economy to Confront the World. The book was published on August this year and has been longlisted for Financial Times and Schroders Business Book of the Year. Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian is the China reporter at Axios, where she writes high-impact investigations, exclusives, and analysis about China with a focus on how China projects power and influence beyond its borders. Congratulations, Bethany, on the book, and welcome to AFI's discussion. And thank you so much for taking out your time for us from your busy schedule.
Thank you so much for having me, Sakina. I'm really looking forward to our discussion today.
Okay, so without further ado, I would like to begin with the first question for Bethany. So, Bethany, I have read your book. It was really, really interesting. And my first question to you regarding the book is that one of the central points that you make in your book to explain the salient nature of the Chinese Communist Party's power is what you have called China's authoritarian economic statecraft. Can you explain what do you mean by this and why is this important? Because almost every large state manipulates international economic activity for strategic purposes. But what is different in the case of China? And what is the CCP trying to do here?
Yeah, so authoritarian economic statecraft is the way that the Chinese government has created quite innovative forms, ways to deny or grant access to its markets in order to shape the decision making of companies, governments, individuals, and multilateral institutions to bring them more in line with the Chinese Communist Party's core interests. Now, it is certainly true that any major state is going to use economic statecraft, which means using its economy to accomplish geopolitical purposes. But what the Chinese government has done is different in several ways. And firstly, when we think of economic statecraft, what we often think of is the most traditional form, which is sanctions. So the US government has the largest sanctions regime in the world. Some of our sanctions, some of US sanctions are quite controversial. But let's compare and contrast a little bit US sanctions and multilateral sanctions as well with the Chinese government's economic statecraft. Sanctions, the way that the US and the UN does them, they are de jure, which means they are by law. You know when they happen. They're transparent. You can go to the US government, the US Treasury website, see who is sanctioned, why they're sanctioned, what date they were sanctioned. And this is part of, as we call it, the rules-based world order, which is to say, we do things by law and transparently. But the Chinese government's use of authoritarian economic statecraft is usually de facto and always opaque. So a lot of what we see, lots and lots and lots of examples, but for example, when Norwegian salmon, so after the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Liu Xiaobo, of course, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee being based in Norway, the Chinese government just stopped allowing the import of Norwegian salmon, which was the Chinese market was the Norwegian salmon's most important export market. But there was no announcement. There was no regulation. It's just that the salmon just stopped being permitted to enter and just was rotting in the ports. And it didn't. And Norwegian salmon did not make it back into China until after the Norwegian government and the Chinese government had a kind of a thaw in relations several years later, when Norway basically said publicly, we will be careful not to infringe upon China's core interests anymore. So you just had to kind of guess that this is the reason this is happening. That's the most common way that the Chinese government does this. A more important difference, and the reason that I call the way that China does this authoritarian, is that it does it to accomplish authoritarian goals, and it does it in authoritarian ways. So again, if you want to look at U.S. and multilateral sanctions, those are levied, and even on the U.S. side, almost exclusively in order to pursue agreed upon multilateral goals. Actually, a quite limited number of goals. So nuclear nonproliferation, combating terrorist financing, combating money laundering to uphold the integrity of the international financial system, to publish gross violators of human rights, more recently to publish Russia for its illegal invasion of Ukraine, which goes against international law, these kinds of things. And for the U.S., use of sanctions is not always agreed upon by the international community. However, the goals that the U.S. is trying to pursue with those sanctions are, with very few exceptions, but I'll give one exception so we can see kind of that the exception really proves the rule here. Under the Trump administration, so the Trump administration sanctioned 2 international criminal court investigators who were investigating potential U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan. This was an obvious abuse of the U.S. sanctions system, and I will call this an authoritarian abuse of the U.S. sanctions system. And when the Biden administration came in, they lifted those sanctions. And so you can see this is very rare. But on the Chinese side, they use their authoritarian economic statecraft, denial and access to the economy exclusively and 100% to pursue China's own narrow geopolitical interests, such as shutting down criticism of China's human rights record, its policies in Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, its maritime sovereignty claims, which have no basis in international law. And then in the COVID pandemic, to shut down scientific exploration and inquiry into the origins of the pandemic.
Thank you, Bethany, for giving a detailed information about China's authoritarian economic statecraft. And speaking about COVID, your book begins with how the CCP handled the COVID-19 pandemic, which you state, I quote, "At their peak, the extreme lockdown saw some 760 million Chinese people confined to their homes and neighborhoods," I unquote. So, Bethany, why did you choose to begin the book with the chapter on COVID-19? And what does the pandemic and the party's response to the pandemic tell us about the Chinese leadership, the Chinese party, and the nature of the Chinese power and influence? Over to you, Bethany.
Well, in my career for quite a number of years, what I have done is I have followed and worked to uncover ways that the Chinese government exerts power beyond its borders in an often, well, not always covert, but certainly quiet way, but most importantly, a coercive way. So we're not talking about traditional hard power like military power, but some other forms of power that it exerts beyond its borders. But before the pandemic, and I have always been very concerned about the way that Beijing does this, because so often it does it in order to silence dissent, to interfere in domestic political processes in other countries, and especially to harass and surveil vulnerable communities, such as Chinese pro-democracy activists, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Taiwanese, and Hong Kongers abroad. But it's been easy for many people to say, that really sucks for Tibetans. That's so unfortunate for them. But they're a really tiny portion of the world's population. That really sucks for Taiwan. How unfortunate for this island of 24 million people. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not that important. We don't see China using these kinds of levers of power in ways that affect more people. So, we don't really need to do anything about it. And that always really frustrated me, but it was a very common narrative that I heard. But what happened with the pandemic was, for the first time ever, the Chinese government deployed these forms of extraterritorial coercion on a topic and in a way that affects the health and well-being of every single person in the world. And that started with trying to blunt scientific inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus pandemic. And we saw so many attempts from the Chinese government to shut down discussion of that, even beyond its borders. And so, an example is when then Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, made a call on the UN floor for an independent inquiry into pandemic origins. And just weeks later, the Chinese government slapped tariffs on a whole swath of Australian exports to China as punishment for that. And we continued to see this behavior from Beijing throughout the pandemic, with disinformation, just covert disinformation about the supposed inefficacy or danger of mRNA vaccines such as Pfizer and Moderna, even though those vaccines are safe and effective. And also, Chinese-made vaccines are great. I'm glad they exist, but the Chinese government wanted to make them seem better and safer than the vaccines that were actually more efficacious than the Chinese-made vaccines. And this is interfering in medical decisions. It's interfering in people's health and well-being, and can even result in people refusing to be vaccinated, which could lead to their deaths. So this is, I saw the significance of this kind of power that the Chinese government uses, affecting everyone for the first time.
Thank you, Bethany. And your book also touched on the work of the United Front and the party's dual function strategy to exert political control with the Chinese diaspora, to silence the dissent, like you said, and punish the parties and push the party's political goals. So, how are democratic nations becoming aware of this strategy and responding to it? How are the Chinese communities living abroad being affected or targeted? How can countries prevent such party state political coercion abroad? Over to you, Bethany.
So dual function strategy, as I outline in my book, is the way that Beijing co-opts real, legitimate community organizations abroad in overseas Chinese communities to make sure that they are in line with the CCP's core interests, and also to have them kind of there if they're ever needed for something to help out with Beijing. And so the result of this is that you see real organizations that do real things. They're not, fronts. They might have community festivals, or they might, help with cross-border business, or they might have, kids activities or something. And those are real. But then sometimes those organizations might also be used for illegitimate and hidden purposes, such as when the Chinese embassy or consulates in the US will call on these groups to interfere in pro-democracy protests. We have a documented case of this happening in Boston a few years ago. There was an FBI, there was a Department of Justice indictment about this. And also, and so these kinds of activities that, kind of create an environment or force people to interfere in democratic freedoms in the places where they live. And it serves to shut down free debate and freedom of speech and freedom of organizing in these communities, because it's very hard to have and maintain an independent Chinese community organization, because there'll be so much pressure coming from Beijing. So the result of this is it fosters a lot of suspicion in the host societies. And then it also, for the Chinese people or the overseas Chinese who are participating in organizations just doing their best to live their normal lives, it can feel like they're being targeted by the host society. And meanwhile, by also being targeted by Beijing. So they're really, a victim of this on both sides. What's good news though, and what I've talked about, this kind of activity happens under the direction of the United Front Work Department, which is a bureau of the Chinese Communist Party. And one of their jobs is abroad to guide and co-opt overseas Chinese communities. So that they're the organization that kind of directs this kind of work. What we've seen in democracies now around the world is a growing knowledge and awareness that the United Front Work Department is a thing that exists. 7 years ago, most people had never heard of it, even though it's been around for like 70, 80 years. And also a growing awareness that there can be real measures that can be taken to help restore some of the democratic freedoms that overseas Chinese communities deserve and that the Chinese government has sought to take away from them. And a big part of that happens just through knowledge and transparency and education. So telling people about this phenomenon. And then also communicating to Chinese communities that they're not alone, and especially to the most vulnerable groups, again, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, Taiwanese, and pro-democracy activists, communicating with them, forming ties with them, and listening to them when they say that they are experiencing harassment. What happened for years up until maybe 2018, 2019, is that people in the US, pro-democracy activists and others, would report to the FBI that they believed they were being harassed or surveilled by Chinese government agents. And this was never investigated. But now the Department of Justice has an Office of Transnational Repression that now actually investigates many of these reports and has issued a growing number of indictments revealing that, yes, in fact, this surveillance and harassment is happening. And that is a very positive step because it communicates to Chinese communities that their concerns are being heard. And most importantly, it communicates to the Chinese government that they can no longer operate with the impunity that they once did.
Thank you, Bethany. And I think there was an excerpt from Alex Zajewski's interview in your book where he mentioned saying that it is not the entire Chinese community living abroad who are involved in this, but only a few, right? So how are they experiencing now? Like you said that there is actually an FBI who's investigating on this transnational regression. So what is the current status? How are the Chinese communities who are living abroad feeling now, currently?
That's absolutely right. People who were, consciously and knowingly involved in the harassment or surveillance or disruption in overseas Chinese communities are a very small number of people. Overwhelmingly, Chinese communities are like any other communities in the world. They just want to have jobs and have kids and have houses and have community events and just lead normal lives. That's overwhelmingly how it is. And so the policies that we've seen have brought more transparency to some of what's happening. But at the same time, and I write about this as part of my book's kind of theme of the pandemic, what also happened during the pandemic is an enormous rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. And it seems that many people targeted anybody targeted people who look Chinese or look Asian out of fear, out of hatred, out of racism, kind of sparked by the pandemic. And so there were violent attacks, all kinds of racist attacks, and even murders around the world and in the US. And so for the Chinese communities in the US during the pandemic, at least, that was really a primary concern, was just the racism they were experiencing, and fear that the Trump administration's rhetoric was inflaming that racism and making that worse. So, if you want to say, just if you want to pick like 10, any random sampling of like Chinese Americans in the US, probably right now still, and certainly during the pandemic, what are you most concerned about? Like anti-Asian racism or the United Front Work Department? Overwhelmingly, it would be anti-Asian racism. So, I think that is something that was and was much more front and center. But again, just to say this once more, I think for the most vulnerable communities, who have experienced the most surveillance and the most harassment and the most restrictions of freedoms. It's not something that could ever be overlooked. And I think, when I speak with Uyghurs and pro-democracy activists and Tibetans, I think there's a strong sense that the U.S. government now is finally really fighting for them, and I think that's a good feeling.
Thank you, Burke. Thank you, Bethany. And you also mentioned about how China has been leveraging sister city relationships in alignment with the Belt and Road Initiative. It was really interesting to know how China uses the cultural and commercial partnerships and transform them into strategic tools for China's geopolitical agenda. Can you elaborate on this, especially in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative? Over to you, Bethany.
Yes, so one of my chapters looks at sister cities, and just a brief history. Sister cities were an initiative that were started in the early days of the Cold War by President Eisenhower, because he wanted people in the East, the different blocks, the East and the West, so people in the U.S. and Europe, to be able to have interactions with people behind the Iron Curtain, because he said that when people groups don't talk to each other, when they don't get to know each other, it fosters distrust and fear and hatred. And so his goal was to have genuine people-to-people exchanges on a local level and get governments out of the way, just get people in a room together, whether they're students or academics or any performers, athletes, anything, get them together in a room so they can get to know each other. And so that was how sister cities were born. And the U.S. and now many countries in the world have sister city relationships. And in democratic countries, it's like the U.S., sister cities is international. It's a nonprofit. It's not a government organization. And it is the umbrella organization for all of the sister city relationships in the U.S. And those are run on the very local level. They're only run by the municipal board that oversees them. They're not being directed by the U.S. State Department, for example. It's only on the local level, and it's purely about exchange. It's not about politics. But on the Chinese side, the Chinese sister cities, and now there's many of them. They were started. I think the first first sister city relationships were founded in the 1970s, a lot more in the 1980s, and now China has more than 1,000 sister city or some kind of sister or friendship partnerships with cities and provinces around the world, with more than 100 countries around the world. And and to be clear, I think that the people on the Chinese side who start these, many of them have that same desire. They want to have these connections. They want to have these local people-to-people exchanges. But of course, it's under the Chinese Communist Party, and so there's a party organization, or they're called a CPAFFC, the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries. Sorry, I messed up that acronym. And that organization is directly overseen by the United Front Work Department. So it's essentially a party organization that oversees sister cities. And that, it doesn't mean that Chinese sister cities are all like, just fronts for like secret party activity. That's not what it is. A lot of the time, it's real, genuine exchange. But again, it's this dual function strategy where these are real partnerships and these are real sister city relationships. But sometimes they can be used and abused for the party's purposes on demand. And I outline this in that chapter with lots and lots of examples. The main one that I give is of a suspected Chinese intelligence operative, Christine Fong, who was operating out of California. And she helped create a new friendship city relationship she was an intern at the mayor's office in Northern California, and she helped create a friendship city in China. And then she used her role in that as a platform to go to mayors conferences around the US. And hopefully this isn't too sensitive for viewers, but she ended up pursuing sexual relationships with between 10 and 15 different mayors. that she met at these conferences in states around the U.S. And she was, being run by the Ministry of State Security, and she was also, operating in Northern California, trying to get close to politicians, trying to curry influence in that way, and have these kind of close relationships in that way. So that's a very obvious abuse of this, kind of an extreme example of an abuse of a sister city relationship. But some other ones, which I've seen consistent examples of this over the years, is that they can also be used, again, targeting the same groups we always see. But for example, Taiwan. So I know of an example dating all the way back to the late 1980s, when there was a high school in Southern California that the city had sister city relationships with quite a number of countries around the world, and China and Taiwan. And so it was hosting an event for, high school students from all these countries. And they had the flags of the countries in the gymnasium, and a delegation of between 6 and 8 Chinese diplomats from the consulate in Los Angeles drove down and came to the gymnasium, created such a disruption. They demanded that the flag of Taiwan be taken down, blah, blah, blah. It was created such a disturbance that after that, when they had this event, this school only used the city flags from all the cities that were represented, rather than using any country flags at all. And I also detail other Taiwan-related examples. So, this is, again, the kind of thing where the solution here is not ban Chinese sister cities, not the solution, not what I'm calling for. Lots of real good exchange happens, but rather to speak openly about what the abuses are, communicate to partners that that's not appropriate, and in that way communicate to the Chinese government that the jig is up, that we know now how they abuse these relationships.
Thank you, Bethany. And you know that Alex Joski, he had appeared on a program to discuss on the book Spies and Lies. And like you mentioned right now about Christine Fang, how she got involved with the US politicians. And in your book also, you mention about, in the chapter called Spies and Sister Cities, right? You've mentioned about Christine Fong. And like I said, like how she got involved with the politicians and all that stuff. Can you tell us, Bethany, how China's system has enabled operatives like Fong to seamlessly integrate and potentially influence foreign political individuals? How are
Yeah.
they doing that?
So the United Front system is really key to that. And now, Christine Fong, she was run through the Ministry of State Security, which is a Chinese government ministry. The United Front Work Department is a party bureau. But, these have areas of overlap. And what we see very clearly with Christine Fong example is that she was able to kind of parachute in to Northern California and use these, we could say United Front linked organizations as a landing pad, and then as a launching pad, where she could just immediately start off and start networking and getting involved. And as one example of that, she was at a university, oh dear, what was it? Cal State Monterey Bay, I think. That was not one of the big famous universities in the Bay Area, but was in proximity. But there was not yet a Chinese Students and Scholars Association. And so when she got there, within just a few weeks, she founded the Chinese Students and Scholars Association with the blessing and help of the San Francisco consulate, the Chinese consulate in San Francisco. And so she was able to be the president of the CSSA. And that was her very first platform. And she held the presidency of the CSSA for, I believe, her entire time when she was a student there. Now, to be clear, she was an undergraduate student, but she was non-traditional. So people who knew her estimate her age to be late 20s, early 30s. She used CSSA as a platform. She started bringing in lots of politicians to give talks to students, and she would help arrange volunteers for their for campaigns and things like that. Now, to be clear, there's nothing wrong with that behavior. That's great. It's, totally great for people, for international students to come to the US and get involved in our political system. That's what we want. The problem with her was that she was doing it at the direction of a foreign intelligence agency for the purpose of getting close to up and coming politicians in the Bay Area. And her most successful, relationship or in that way was Eric Swalwell. And when she first met him, he was only a local city councilor, but he was soon elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. And she helped him. She was a bundler for his 2014 election campaign, and which made her, quite influential in his office. And as I write about in my book, she and Eric Swalwell did have a sexual relationship for a period of time. He was not married at the time, but that was as soon as the FBI informed him. He was given a defensive briefing. As soon as they informed him of who she really was, he cut off all ties with her. But in any case, through Christine Fong's use of CSSAs, which have a well-known standing relationship with consulates and can serve as kind of tools of the Chinese government at times, and sister cities and the sister city mayors conferences, she was able to use these United Front linked organizations to very quickly get her networking off the ground.
So one of the most interesting chapter on your book was about Zoom meetings, where activists like Wang Dan and many others, they've experienced the meetings being shut down and the accounts being suspended. So this has been referred to as the technological invasion. Bethany, how do these incidents reflect China's capacity to influence and assert control beyond its borders, especially in the realm of technology? And what can be done by the US to counter such a threat?
Well, the Zoom example, I think, demonstrates that the Chinese government wants to identify and is very actively working to identify every lever of influence and power it can beyond its borders. And regardless of laws and norms and even its own commitments, it is willing to subvert any of these kind of relationships or ties in order to achieve its own goals. So with the Zoom case, Zoom is a U.S. company founded in 2011 in California, but they had more than 700 employees based in China. Their R&D team, in order to save money, they said it was because it was cheaper to operate there. And in 2019, the Chinese government blocked Zoom from the Chinese market, meaning its software, its video platform could not be used by Chinese users, and demanded that Zoom create a rectification plan to show that it would do a better job at surveilling, monitoring calls in China in real time, handing over information about them in real time if needed, and handing over any information at any time as requested by China's security and intelligence services. And so that's what they did. That they created that exact rectification plan. And at the time, in 2019, this was not public knowledge. Another thing that they were required to do was appoint a Zoom employee as a liaison for the Ministry of State Security and Ministry of Public Security. So he was the official liaison between Zoom and China's security and intelligence agencies. And that's really where things started to go off the rails, because the demands that those agencies began to make, especially after the pandemic began to increase. And, so for Zoom, we all experienced this. Before the pandemic, Zoom had 10 million daily users. After the pandemic began, by April, it had more than 300 million daily users. So pandemic was a great windfall for Zoom, also a great windfall for China's security services, who, now had this lever of control over a company that was having 300 million people use its platform daily to communicate. And so the MSS and MPS started giving more and more demands to this Zoom employee named Julian Jean. And so he did what they asked. And sometimes he used normal channels within Zoom to hand over information about users outside of China. And sometimes he kind of subverted Zoom's own regulations and guidelines to accomplish what the MSS asked of him. And so he was able to shut down some meetings that were happening around June 4th memorials, based in the US, meetings that were based in the US, and shut down US Zoom accounts based in the US, opened by US citizens, paid forward by US credit cards. He was able to successfully shut them down in that way. But what happened was the Department of Justice, after I wrote a story about this happening, and then it became a big media storm, lawmakers got involved and wrote letters to Zoom demanding answers. The Department of Justice began an investigation and issued a groundbreaking indictment in December 2020, revealing a lot of this information about Julian Gene and how he had managed to do these things that the Chinese government had asked of him. And one of the alarming sort of takeaways from this is that I think this is the first publicly known example of Article 7 of China's National Intelligence Law, 2017 National Intelligence Law, coming into play. So that Article 7 of that law says that any person or company, or entity must hand over all data to the Ministry of State Security, or to China's intelligence services upon request, or provide any assistance upon request. And here's the key thing: and keep that assistance a secret. And in the case of Zoom, Julian Gene kept some of his activities as a Zoom employee secret from his own supervisors. So eventually, after this indictment, Zoom did fire Julian Gene, but I'm not really satisfied with Zoom's response. And I think that one of the things that the US needs to do is provide a better regulatory environment. And so one of the things I call for in my book is to have a regulation for US companies, that if any US company, particularly a tech company, has an employee who is, or a contractor who is a liaison for the China's intelligence or security services, that the name of that person and their specific role and duties be made public through publicly filed disclosures, that their email address be made public, and that their any requests made to them be made public as well. Why is that significant? Well, it puts the 2017 National Intelligence Law, Article 7, and this regulation, if it were to happen, on a collision course. And so that would be, now if you have two laws that are at odds, what you have is two regulatory states, or two legal systems, or really two governments who are at odds. And this is more of a fair fight. When you have the world's largest authoritarian government, the world's largest authoritarian single-party state, versus one company, who's going to win every single time? So it's not fair. I think it's just not fair to say that U.S. companies just need to act morally. No, we need to regulate them so that they must act in the correct way.
So another strategy, Bethany, that we're going to talk about is China's wolf warrior diplomacy, the strategy of spreading big lies to protect China's image, and how China has been extending its censorship and disinformation tactics and controlling the narratives of sensitive topics like the Hong Kong, Tibet, Uyghurs, and the Chinese pro-democracy activists. Please tell us more about this strategy as well, Bethany. I think you're on mute, Bethany.
Let me first recommend a really excellent book on this topic called China's Civilian Army, The Rise of Wolf Warrior Diplomacy by Peter Martin. A wonderful kind of retelling of China's history through its Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then how we got to where we are with wolf warrior diplomacy. But as I write in the book, what we saw at the end of 2019. So for those of us who've kind of been in the China watching space and virtual space for a long time, we all knew that there were very few Chinese diplomats or government officials on Twitter. When they did, for the few of them that were there, when they tweeted it, it was very, very boring and kind of turgid, and It had very few followers. But what happened at the end of 2019 and into early 2020 was that there was this huge rise in the number of Chinese diplomatic accounts. So suddenly more and more Chinese diplomats started opening Twitter accounts. And then also that their tweets became just like much more inflammatory and, tended to go kind of viral. I mean, often criticism of the West, but sometimes you would see, Chinese ambassadors or diplomats really harshly criticizing the countries they were based in, including like India or like, I think it was maybe Colombia or Venezuela or, Sri Lanka, places like that, which is kind of the number one rule of diplomacy. Like, don't shit all over the country that you're like a diplomat to, because you're supposed to be trying to, foster good relations with them. But the interesting thing is that this kind of began to create an ecosystem or participate in or really create an ecosystem on Twitter that was much more friendly to Chinese government lines, the Chinese government rhetoric. Circa 2014, for example, Twitter was if you look at any conversations about China on Twitter or Chinese language conversations on Twitter, they were very skewed towards like pro-democracy, because people would jump the Great Firewall to get on Twitter to speak freely. So it was people who wanted to speak freely about China. But after 2019 and into 2020, we saw, a much greater obvious state-backed effort to try to just, by brute force, kind of change the narrative on Twitter, combined with the rise of Chinese state-backed disinformation operations on Twitter as well, bots, inauthentic messaging campaigns, etc. And interestingly, much more connectivity with Russia-backed accounts. So these accounts retweeting each other, quote tweeting each other, amplifying each other, and it created this whole ecosystem that became very loud and became, in fact, quite dominant on Twitter. And that was really largely in place by the time the pandemic began. And so when the Chinese government began, what I call its big lie in late February 2020, that the pandemic did not start in China, there was this system in place to disseminate these false narratives and, competing disinformation about maybe it was the US government, maybe it was the US military that brought excuse me, that brought the virus to Wuhan. Maybe the US government created in biolabs in Ukraine, like, all this kind of competing narratives. And the effect of that, is to sometimes these accounts will gang up on people who are saying things online that the Chinese government doesn't like. Again, same groups, pro-democracy activists, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, Taiwanese, and also, Western commentators and journalists as well, making the online space much less friendly, much more hostile to them as people, and also much less, conducive to having truly free discussion about China.
Thank you, Bethany. And another chapter of your book talks about Hong Kong, where you highlight the implications of the national security law on global activism and the chilling effect that it has on international support for the Hong Kong protest. There is this additional recent development of Hong Kong authorities offering bounties on some of the activists. So based on your research and observations, Bethany, how do you see the future of global activism related to China in the face of such authoritative measures? And what strategies can the activists adopt to navigate these challenges?
Yes, that's right. The national security law in Hong Kong is kind of like a whole nother level of this. If we're viewing a lot of what I've outlined as a way for China to rather quietly sometimes extend its power abroad, the national security law is like using a bullhorn. We're doing this. And I remember, getting the full-length draft of the law was released at the same time that the law was implemented in Hong Kong. Not, this would be like the opposite of democracy. Anyway, and that was noon DC time, midnight Hong Kong time on like July 1st or something, 2020. And I remember, they posted it online and I started reading. And I was like, oh, this is not good. This is not good. This is very serious. And then I got to Article 37 and Article 38 of the National Security Law. And it said, this law applies to residents outside of Hong Kong. What does that mean? And I was reading Chinese, and like my Chinese is good, but not native. And I was like, did I misread this? And so I called up 4 or 5 experts on Chinese law that afternoon and asked them, I read it to them. I said, what does this mean? And they were like, well, it means that the national security law applies to everybody, everywhere. And I was like, oh, which is, it's like kind of terrifying. Because the law it's so vaguely written, it's so broad, it can be used to to accuse of terrorism or separatism, almost any kind of activity or behavior or organizing or whatever. And it also explicitly gives the Hong Kong government the right to use the financial system, Hong Kong being an important financial hub, to use the financial system to go after these people, freezing their assets, etc. And so on paper, the law grants sweeping extraterritorial jurisdiction to the Hong Kong government. In practice, it's been something that we've seen the Hong Kong authorities, of course, with Beijing behind them, trying to build on their ability to actually enforce this beyond Hong Kong's borders. It is very difficult because, among other things, many countries can't suspended their extradition treaties with Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong authorities so far have not made really strong efforts to abuse the financial system to go after people's assets, but they could. But we are seeing a growing number of increasingly concerning behavior from Hong Kong authorities, as you mentioned, the bounties, arrest warrants issued for people based abroad, including former Hong Kong lawmakers. And there's been letters. So I think John Lee, when he was still like the equivalent of the interior minister, the security minister of Hong Kong, now he's the chief executive, he wrote a letter to the Wall Street Journal in London for an op-ed that someone there wrote, saying this probably violates the national security law. Now, there were, Hong Kong didn't arrest anybody for that, but it definitely has a very strong chilling effect on lots of people, because as long as you're able to not go to Hong Kong and you don't have major assets in Hong Kong, you'll be okay. But if you have family there, or if you need to still be able to go back there, you cannot be active. You cannot speak freely online. We've seen people be arrested for tweets made outside of Hong Kong. They get arrested when they go back to Hong Kong. We've seen people's family members being detained and harassed in Hong Kong because of this stuff the family member did. And so as a result of that, Hong Kongers abroad now are, I remember a few months ago here in Taipei, I went to the Tiananmen Memorial and spoke with some Hong Kongers who were there. And for the first time, previously you speak to Hong Kongers anywhere and they'll talk freely about anything, like anybody from a democratic country. And now, the people I spoke to, they didn't want to use their name. They were very, very concerned that I not publish their photograph or anything like that because of this fear. So, for people who are willing to cut off all ties to Hong Kong, China doesn't yet have the ability to reach abroad and get them back. But for anybody else who needs to maintain their ties to Hong Kong, they have to be silent. And if they want to maintain their freedom, they have to be silent. I think you're on mute.
So in this regard, Bethany, how do you see the future of activists, and what strategies can the activists do to navigate such challenges?
I think that Western governments or democratic governments have really failed the people of Hong Kong. There were, beyond like a few sanctions and some strongly worded tweets, the international community really didn't do anything. And that's partially because of timing. And I think that's no coincidence that the Chinese government used the chaos the pandemic, and how all these democratic countries were very, very distracted by the millions of people dying from the pandemic, to push this very draconian law through, knowing that the governments just didn't have the bandwidth to do anything, and they were right. And yes, like the U.S. Downgraded its economic status, Hong Kong's economic status, and various countries suspended their extradition treaties, but there were no real, and there were some sanctions, such as on Carrie Lam, former chief executive, and some others. But China didn't really face any consequences for this, not really. And they basically abrogated their treaty commitments from the Sino-British agreement of 1984. They basically abrogated that treaty with impunity, and that's on us. And it's hard now sometimes to even get prominent headlines about what's happening in Hong Kong. And I would like to see democratic governments in like-minded countries push harder against Hong Kong authorities, and like in the Zoom case, place regulations on U.S. companies and international companies that make it illegal for them to comply with demands of the national security law. Now, in some cases, that's already true. Handing over certain kinds of data will put these companies in a legal bind. And as a result of that, some companies have left Hong Kong. I think we need more regulations like that.
And what happened to Samuel Chu? Like, I believe that he was, in your book is written that he was the first US citizen charged under this law, right? So did anything positive happen to him? Did he get help?
I mean, I think that he's received a lot of attention for that. There was a New York Times article written about him when that happened. But he's a U.S. citizen. His organization is a U.S. registered organization, which again is astonishing. That the Hong Kong government would issue an arrest warrant for him, and one of the charges was like what do they call it? Like colluding with a foreign government. But like, it's his government. Like, he's a U.S. citizen, and so he was lobbying U.S. lawmakers. He's not colluding with a foreign government. It's his democratic right as a U.S. citizen to do that. And so this law is again, is a theme, interfering in basic core tenets of domestic democratic processes, trying to deny him that right, or make that right dangerous or risky for him. I mean, he's based in the U.S., so he's okay. I'm much more concerned about the people who's had to go into exile, leave their lives behind, leave their family, cut off ties to their family, stop talking to their family because it's risky for their family. Yeah.
Okay, so Xi Jinping and the CCP have overseen the building of the party-state capitalism and have shunned a liberal economic system and liberal capitalism. And they are now trying to integrate political control and economy and manage them both efficiently. Is this possible? And if Xi Jinping and the party succeeds, then what are the implications for the world and for democratic values and traditional capitalism?
Yeah. Well, I want to kind of separate a couple of things here. There are various kinds of economic models, and if we're talking about pure economy, you can have a state capitalist model, you can have a very neoliberal, lightly regulated model, you can have all these kinds of different versions of capitalism. I personally don't care what anybody uses as long as it gives people good lives. And I think that there's no relationship between capitalism and democracy. So I don't think that capitalism is freedom. It's not. It's just an economic system. And democracy is the thing that we care about here. So for China to have whatever kind of capitalism it has, just from an economic perspective, I don't care. I think it's however they want to manage it, as long as they're from an economic perspective managing it well. I think that's great, and I think the Chinese government has done a good job of managing its economy, again, just from a purely economic perspective. But what concerns me is the party element of this party state capitalism. And that's where things, that's where my deep concerns lie, because that is integrating very targeted and selective political control over economic behavior. This isn't like central planning. This isn't collectivizing the farms. This is allowing for a lot of free choice, allowing for a lot of market decision making, except in certain crucial moments, as to use party language, in certain crucial moments when the state can reach in and direct economic behavior, either to achieve political outcomes or to achieve, to redirect the economy to achieve economic outcomes. And the authoritarian economic statecraft that I write about is basically the international extension of party state capitalism. So, let's go back to the Norwegian salmon example. The Chinese government doesn't have a 5-year plan regulating every piece of fish that comes in through its borders. So they let people, importers, basically operate on a market model, generally. However, except when they need it to not be that way. So in the case of Norwegian salmon not being allowed into China's borders, they had enough of a selectively targeted mechanism to stop that for purely political reasons. They weren't even trying to help their own domestic fish farmers. This was to punish Norway. So this is the party state capitalism. I think that it's clearly effective in certain ways. In certain ways, I mean, it's certainly effective at helping achieve China's authoritarian goals. Absolutely, very effective at that. Is it good for people? Here's the real question. Is it good for the human beings in China? I mean, no. I think that there maybe 2 or 3 years ago, it was looking pretty good. It was looking like a pretty enviable model because the Chinese government was able to utilize some of these levers in a really kind of radical way to stop the spread of the coronavirus and have their zero COVID policy. And for a while that looked great, but then it got out of hand, and we had this, the zero COVID policy extended far beyond what it should and interfered with economic activity, and the Chinese economy took a hit. We've also seen I think it's now we're at a point we can call it an overextension of politics over economic decision making. I think maybe circa 2017 it was a little bit more balanced. I'm not saying I'm a supporter, but it was a little bit more balanced. Now it seems that politics is generally trumping economics in many cases right now in China, and we're seeing at least from foreign companies, the results of that, which is there was a recent annual survey of foreign companies in China, and they're showing lower confidence in the Chinese market than in decades, I think maybe since the survey has ever been unveiled. So it's really harming certainly foreign company confidence in the Chinese market. And it's really getting to the point where basic economic data is being suppressed. And that's making just basic economic decision making much harder for foreign companies. I do think that sometimes, especially in the US, we take any kind of government intervention in the economy and we're like, oh, socialism bad. And that's not right. This is the US is way too far into removing regulation. We're extremely neoliberal. That has not been good for our economy. It's not been good for workers. It's not been good for anybody except the people who get rich from it. And so, just as a caveat, I think that the way that Xi Jinping has tried to crack down on and restructure a little bit the tech industry in China, I don't know yet if that's going to be successful, but I think that part of his motivation for doing that wasn't wrong, that it was trying to avoid the industry-wide kind of distortion, the economic distortion that the tech industry has created in the U.S. And that's not a bad thing. However, at the same time, it was also clearly Xi Jinping's crackdown on the tech industry was also clearly a power play that he was afraid of any one company or any one CEO gaining too much power and being able to, push back against the primacy of the party. So we get both of those things. And if there was a kind of equilibrium a few years ago, we're no longer there. And I am concerned now about the future of China's economy, both for structural reasons, but also for political reasons. And even more, I'm concerned about just the basic well-being of many Chinese people who have, had the freedom and the means to become prosperous and wealthy in many cases over the past 40 years. And I'm concerned that they may feel crushed, and that their innovative spirit may not have the freedom. They may not have the freedom to express their innovative spirit in the way that they have in the past.
Okay, so lastly, Bethany, is the talk of a peak China still premature?
Oh,
Like,
absolutely.
doesn't aging? Yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. Sorry, Bethany. Okay, so. Yeah, so does an aging and declining population, rising youth unemployment, de-risking strategies adopted by advanced economies, a Xi's policy that prioritizes national security over development, and a property sector that accounts for 30% of China's economy in crisis fundamentally changed the trajectory of Chinese economy and power. Over to you, Bethany, now.
It's absolutely far too early to talk about peak China. I almost think it's a little bit ridiculous that we're even talking about it. I mean, yes, the Chinese economy is facing headwinds, but like every economy in the world faces headwinds, sometimes. And what we do see is that, Xi Jinping has clearly been trying to create the foundation for years for a transition to a different economic model, with his huge emphasis on high value manufacturing and dominance in emerging technologies. I mean, huge, years long, if not decades long, push by China's leadership, including Xi Jinping, to try to have that as a major driver of the Chinese economy instead of real estate and infrastructure development and manufacturing. So clearly, this is something that they have been aware of for a long time and trying to create a path out of it. And look, the Chinese economy is massive. It's the second largest economy in the world, 3/4 the size of the U.S. economy, and by some estimates, purchasing power parity, some people think it's already equal to or has surpassed the U.S. economy. It's huge, and it's not going anywhere. So if you look at growth rates, let's say it's hard to know because again, the data is they're withholding some data, but probably around 4.5% growth rate. I mean, that's great. If the US had a 4.5% growth rate, we'd all be celebrating. Like it's a huge economy and it's still growing. Certain sectors are really, really hurting. And the real estate sector is never going to be what it was before. And so in the, I would say, medium term, real pain in major industries, and that's going to have downstream effects throughout the Chinese economy, but it has many ongoing areas of strength, and it's still growing and it's huge. So China's going to be an economic power for like decades to come. And yes, like they have a low birth rate, and that is going to create more challenges in the future and may have some downward pressure on economic growth as well. But again, common problem across Europe and East Asia. And so in the question of, is China like declining or something, you have to ask in comparison to whom, right? And if this is a very common problem across the world's most developed economies, in terms of relative power, like the Chinese economy is like not necessarily facing in that way a hugely unique problem.
Thank you so much, Bethany. And I would once again like to thank you for your time. Like I said before, that I know that you have lots of interviews and events to attend to. And I keep seeing your Twitter updates almost every day regarding your book, Beijing Rules. Bethany, I strongly feel that the success of this book is celebrated not just by you, not just by Bethany Allen, but by all of us, especially for the vulnerable communities who are still facing repression under the CCP's policies and the pro-democracy activist. This book has it all and delivers all the information that the world needs to know, because China is not just for us. It is for the and is not just for certain communities, but it is for the world to watch and the world to be aware of. Thank you so much, Bethany, once again, and thank you so much for this wonderful book. And I strongly recommend this book to our viewers. So please go and grab your copy from the nearest bookstore or buy it from online. It is available on Amazon, and you can even get the Kindle format for the book. And before I end, let me quickly tell you that the video of the session will be uploaded on Asia Freedom Institute's website, www.asiafreedominstitute.org. And please follow AFI's Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn pages for more information and activities regarding Asia Freedom Institute. Thank you. Thank you, Bethany.
Thank you so much, Sakina. This was a great discussion.